Yeah, I'm all right. Okay.
Okay. What we want to continue today for a bit in this second half of the course is to have background reading, which we'll cover some of, but not try to cover it systematically, but to really adapt to themes that emerge, especially a course paper candidate. And what we did last time Monday was to talk about how we can learn, and that's what we try to have in the discussion here with everybody. Not to focus on one paper narrowly, but to have lessons for implications for all of us in the course that we can learn from. And I've seen now what we have is a good example, excellent preparation for a possible paper, but also laying things out very clearly. And so we want to then follow up on some of the points on Monday, namely how to adapt from things from the literature, quote unquote, that is especially things on the reading on the syllabus we're reading here and talking about. How can we adapt them and link them to one city, one case, one theme? And we have some examples here in this draft paper. But we also want to use it as an occasion to try to talk with all of us to think about where and how we can all learn from the specific topic. That is, how can we creatively adapt from a case study of New Haven or Atlanta, and that in turn generalized globally in this huge battle over how power is centralized or decentralized, and that continues with the last 2 weeks of the election in the U.S. So, with that, let's Jack. Your full name is
Jack McKay.
Jack McKay, and tell us tell us a little bit about the background, how you got interested in this draft proposal, and then let just lay it out a little bit. We'll talk about it. Especially, let you please pose some things that you'd like to have input, or that you're thinking about 2 or 3 different ways of doing it, and we can then think about how about what are the advantages of each or something else. That kind of thing. Let's make it an open discussion, and in ways that we can all think about ourselves, of all of you. That is, even if most of you are not doing papers, you will be in life, and we have exams, and we have, most of all, the thinking about these issues which we're trying to articulate explicitly in this course. There is no a clear line we are presenting. We are showing there are many people disagreeing. There are these what seemed in the 19th century to have been clear lines, and the more we get into the 21st century, we're all over the lot. And so and you do this a little bit in your paper, so please, let's walk us through.
Yeah, awesome. So I guess the topic of my paper mainly focuses on the ethical redevelopment through cultural investments and urban renewal, specifically focusing on Chicago as the main case study, kind of using Theaster Gates' work and what he's done to this area as kind of a case study for what can be done more broadly. I guess as far as my interest in the topic more generally is I took urban innovation my freshman year. That was kind of when I was first introduced to Theaster Gates and his work, and kind of building upon that understanding into coming into this quarter, seeing how that can compare and kind of pair with other concepts from other readings, such as the city as an entertainment machine or scenescapes, and focus more on these broad topics of more urban entertainment and creating a cultural hub that revitalizes communities. So that's the main general overview, and those are kind of the 3 main readings that or main texts that I'll be focusing on. But as far as general challenges, I think I have a good, solid environment to start the paper as far as the general idea. But as far as really honing in on not just focusing on the case study of Chicago, but also kind of like what you said, as far as finding applicability elsewhere in terms of scaling up that kind of insight that we can gather in Chicago to other areas.
Excellent. What led you to be interested in, say, especially Theaster Gates' way of doing these things?
Well, I think it was really just being at the University of Chicago and living in Hyde Park over the past, 3.5 years now, and kind of just being in that environment and seeing how his work has kind of impacted things through studying it, was really what piqued my interest, just because I can more personally relate to, the surrounding areas right now and kind of the potential that's there for cultural redevelopment, especially within the commercial.
How about a couple of more concrete examples of this? Most people are not from Chicago.
Yeah.
And were you?
No, I was not. So I'm from San Francisco, kind of the Bay Area.
Okay. So what did you do in 3.5 years that really changed your views or of something, or got more information about Theaster Gates?
I would just say seeing how certain areas are left behind.
The what areas?
Just in the south side of Chicago.
South side, okay.
Yeah, more like the Hyde Park area, south side of Chicago more generally.
Well, I'd say be careful. More generally, Hyde Park is a huge exception for most of the south side, and most, as I talked about, the whole city. This was the anti-machine, the reform through the 20th century. 2-3 aldermen in the city council said those things, and 47, 48, 46 disagreed, and Hyde Park is a huge exception.
Yeah.
But go ahead. What have you done in 3.5 years that sort of gave you a feel for this? Did you see any of Theaster Gates' actual projects, or was it more generally the problems of the South Side, or outside Hyde Park, or what?
Yeah, I would say it's more generally just the problems of the South Side and problems outside of Hyde Park.
How much came from the media, and how much came from seeing things personally?
I think it was mainly just driven by seeing things personally.
Okay, now that's good. What?
I would just say driving around.
Okay.
Is mainly like the first thing that really stood out to me, just because I've never really been, in the area before, as far as being new to the Chicagoland area. So really seeing that, just driving throughout the South Side, it really opened my eyes to that kind of reality.
Seeing that, what was that opened your eyes? I'm trying to get a little more.
Yeah, I would just say areas that have been left behind in terms of commercial development, in general abandonment of certain areas. That's just something I hadn't really seen before, and I thought Theaster's work on addressing those type of issues and kind of revitalizing kind of stood out to me in that aspect.
Okay, and I'm just adding a brief historical note. Left Behind was not as simple as walking away or history. That is, there was a huge change in aspects of the South Side. Was the assassination of Bobby Kennedy and Martin Luther King within a couple of weeks, and that was the time when there were disturbances. Some 45 blocks were closed off, burned. Buildings were, storefronts were broken in because of the anger and the resentment. And there were specifically many Jewish-owned shops in African-American neighborhoods, such as where I live. Martin Luther King Drive from Hyde Park up to McCormick Place. Most of those shops were completely burned at that one point. And I was looking at it from my window, seeing 45 blocks of things going up in smoke. I had a German visitor, and he said, my God, if this happened in Germany, they thought this is the end of this is a German revolution within the country. This shows what I'm taking away from this, the stability of American democracy, that people don't feel that this is threatened. Notice the difference with the text, at least the rhetoric is almost different now with the Trump the Trump discussion. So, but go ahead. So in that sense, many of those same shops have been abandoned ever since.
Mm-hmm.
Sometimes there were Koreans who came in, sometimes there were Arabs, a few African Americans, even though this is a 98% African American neighborhood. But these are not just, this is not just history. These were active changes. And I bike all over the area. Another way that I feel it is when I get thrown stones at. That is, when there's national and media discussion in Chicago about, the racial conflicts, people throw, what are you doing here? They're throwing stones, etc. As I bike by with a whitish looking face. Other times, people say, hey, nice day, something like that. So there are things of that simple ethnographic sort which I'm mentioning, which you as a student, observer, visitor from and that is, San Francisco has got plenty of unusual, which is why I'm pressing a little bit. I mean, you're not from a little you're not from, say, Palo Alto.
Oh, I'm from like northern, across the bridge. So.
Okay.
I want to see.
That is a little bit different.
Yeah.
Okay. But okay, well, go ahead. Tell us about your paper, and with saying some specific. That is, what do you want to do that's a little different from what you've already read about Theaster Gates?
Yeah. So what I really want to focus on more, I would say, outside of Theaster Gates, is focusing on kind of more scaling up his ideas for redevelopment by creating more of these types of scenescapes, kind of cultural amenities that really grow like an urban population, as opposed to just focusing on like his project with the Stony Island Arts Bank. A lot of those seem very, just getting started with that general concept, but seeing how that could be extrapolated out to really lead to more broader change in an area and really fuel that cultural redevelopment.
Okay, I mean that's fantastic. That's what everybody has been, I won't say everybody, many leading critics or encouragers of him have said, you ought to do that. And he for several years has said, how? Or I don't know how to do that. So if you have some potential suggestions, tell us one or two, or even if you don't have any specifics yourself now, what might you do in trying to write the paper to move in that direction? I mean, it's ambitious, it's big, it's interesting, and so congratulations.
Yeah, thank you. I mean, as far as journal ideas, I'm definitely not as well versed as Theaster Gates. Like if he can't figure it out.
But he's changed. He's learned himself.
Yeah, that's true. I think I would focus more on not only building these cultural centers and building communities together, but also integrating more commercial opportunities to really help revitalize things, as opposed to, like, he has a very deep emphasis on like the arts specifically. But I think if you're building a city or a specific area, it'd be better to kind of diversify with those interests as far as entertainment options go, and other types of those type of scenes that kind of attract individuals, and then also pairing that with kind of or just commercial economic avenues so people can live and thrive there.
Take the street where his art bank is located. He has said, some people have said, now that you've done this, we've had inquiries that they want to have Target come into the area, and he there replied, that's the last thing. I mean, we don't want to drive them out. That is, he doesn't want retail. He doesn't want jobs. He doesn't want shops. He wants specific types.
Yeah.
And thoughts. And so, in that sense, an extreme version is Boulder, Colorado had a city council passed a law, no big box shopping in Boulder, period.
Yeah.
So in that sense, or in some others will say, no franchise, big brands of KFC, McDonald's, and so forth. Not permitted.
Yeah.
They want to have local restaurants.
Yeah.
And so forth. So he is closer in that direction, in the sense that the thing which he's implicitly, almost explicitly arguing against is gentrification.
Yeah.
Rich people, white people, outside other neighborhoods, and that in Chicago. I mean, that you can find this everywhere in the world, but this is especially true, more true in Chicago than in many other cities, say like LA. LA consciously wants to weaken little neighborhood attachments, and so they have large geographic regions with a small number of city council members and try to serve the general area. Chicago does the opposite. 50 aldermen, 50 little wards. And they were created initially to be persons who were from a similar national background, like Poles, Italians, or even one city within Mexico, where they tend to live in a couple of streets, who may be from a few streets within a small town, would live within a few streets in Chicago, and so forth. So that many precinct captains, organizers, and Theaster are very sensitive to this in ways that other leaders say this is parochialism, bad, corruption can flow out of it, etc. Favors are exchanged, and that's a different way of doing a different kind of political culture, as we've seen. So, where and how to embrace what he wants to do is, what's his term? Ethical redevelopment. All right. I don't think I ever heard it before. That is, after we brought out Scenescapes, the book, we got some inquiries from staff working with Theaster Gates. They said, we're interested in trying to learn more about this. So we had a couple of sessions with them. We had a workshop, and some of them came here, and and then there were 4 students who did MAs, master's theses, where they would work on some aspect of Theaster Gates. One of them worked on the programs at the Art Bank. Another one was on the program for Theaster Gates, because he didn't have a program. That is, he said, this is in his video in Colorado. He says explicitly, I wanted to follow something the way many, artists put out a program and the like. I didn't have anything, so I had to come up with something. And the foundations were giving him money, and they were saying, give us an evaluation of what you've done in terms of your goals. See, he didn't have anything written out. So he put together what was then these steps, which he then launched and presented here in a joint workshop. We had a 1 week of meetings of people who came from the Scenes Project, from Korea, from Japan, from China, Italy, and so forth, and they all came to Chicago. And in the Wednesday, he had Theaster Gates had a launching of his ethical relativism. So so we had a large audience there. But the simple point is, he wants to appeal both to the general public and to advanced people who are really, let's say, real estate developers, because he is a developer in that sense. He wants to buy a rundown, house for $10,000 and not to resell at a higher price, to keep it, to build it as something that makes the neighborhood a valuable aspect of it, a library, old records, and so forth, and then having lectures, having movies, black movie nights, etc. So in that sense, what I'm giving you in simple terms, his sensitivity for what are important aspects distinguishing that neighborhood, that he then wants to add to it or retain it. we've seen that. I'll say it explicitly right here for more general purposes. to link your paper and this example of Theaster Gates to generalizing, broadening, with the idea that the term is a very hot ideological and a social science concept of gentrification, and so the anti-gentrification is that this may be achieved. This may be achieved by having new people who may move into a neighborhood, who may not have even the black face, but they want to retain the distinctiveness of the of the local area. So Japonica Brown's Saraceno, on our syllabus, page 5, her book is called How Places Make Us, Novel LBQ Identities in 4 Small Cities. So what her point here is to say LBQ or LGBTQ with different combinations, even for only the ladies involved, she shows in 4 different cities in the U.S., you get 4 drastically different subcultures illustrated. And that if you move there, even if you may be of the same sexual orientation in Portland, Maine, or in Ithaca, New York, or in a town in California, you've got to drastically change your clothes, your outlook. And so in Ithaca, the women there have lunch and dinner with other people who are not just men and women, not just women, but women and men, etc. And they don't look as if they're anything different from heterosexual, if you will. In the California group, they dress in bikinis and they're flirting with each other on the beach together. Drastically different kind of subculture. Okay, so in that sense, I mean that's in a sense it's so I mean it's obviously different, but to have someone say this and then to add those specificities really made a very important big point that the a sort of group identity, which is discussed, for instance, among both Republicans and Democrats within the parties right now, is where and how is it appropriate to try to appeal to a particular group? And was it a mistake of Harris to appeal to women of a particular sort? Is it, etc.? And was it in contrast to Bernie Sanders said you should appeal to the working class. The Democratic Party should appeal to work, so what the book shows and what you can do here is to say, use a sensitivity, which Theaster Gates is doing, as to how you can try to capture what are those neighborhood specifics, which you can try to incorporate. So, I mean, again, a crude, simple example from the earlier book from Japonica Saraceno. Japonica Brown-Saraceno is her name. Her earlier book was on, she did a PhD at Northwestern, trained by one of ours, former faculty here, Wendy Griswold. And the one thing she had was an example of people who were not Swedish, but lived in a Swedish neighborhood, and they would celebrate dancing Swedish dances in this one neighborhood in Chicago. And that these new persons, some of whom were lesbians, some of whom were not, but who said, we wanted to continue and recognize the Swedish specifics of this neighborhood, and we'll learn how to do those Swedish dances. Okay, so that gives you a sense of the kinds of specifics which could be distinctive. That is, that what they're mostly saying is, we're not trying to change the neighborhood. We're trying to continue the culture and the specifics of that neighborhood that is there, rather than saying we want to. I mean, the crude outside definition of what's a yuppie. You're drinking Starbucks with a New York Times underneath your shoulder, walking your dog. Okay, that kind of thing they don't do. They instead they learn Swedish. They learn a Swedish dance rather than bringing an outside franchise national symbol of the New York Times and Starbucks. Okay, so how is there anything that you might be able to generalize from that could be a mechanism, which I'm partially pointing in that direction by saying, looking at the reading list, looking at the related literature, even though this is not about Chicago, it's not about Theaster Gates, but in a sense, it has the same message as he does. Look at a subculture with some genuine subtlety. So the way that he did this in the one-day session with him was that he had his own staff work with other people who were mostly actors or musicians. They were artists, and they created some kind of new either way of dancing or singing or writing a new poem that captured, in some cases, LGBTQ or black African American South Side, or something else. But rather than trying to create it themselves, they tried to have a person who may have been of that background, but who could give you an artistic enactment of this, shown with the subtlety and the richness which you can get more often and expect from the arts than from a social science 3 equations. Okay. So, any thoughts about from that is? So I'm not answering, but I'm asking for you. Might there? Yeah, you're mentioning these 3 books. Are there any other things in the readings that might be helpful in doing your paper?
I would say outside the 3 readings I have so far, I do think, like you said, looking at other cases, like you were talking about comparing San Francisco culture to New York, and that type could help reinforce throughout as far as the value of keeping authenticity in neighborhoods and how to deal with that sensitivity while carrying out these kind of cultural ethical redevelopments at a kind of getting scaled up as they go, in a positive way. But I'll have to look into it more in depth as far as finding more parallels that would tie into Theaster's work in other areas.
Yeah, and I mean, you don't have space and time to lay out to describe anything in one detail. But if you can, in say under normal max of 20 pages, you can try to have some methods, some procedures that you could do a little bit of, and say, here are 5 strategies which might be used to try to scale up Theaster Gates' activities. And so you stated it very clearly and briefly at the beginning, but take a few more steps and say, for example, to look at not just say the names of that is, if you name, just here's another quick thing that everybody try to remember. If you try to say, here's something to generalize about or from, and you use a proper name like New York or San Francisco, you're not doing social science. That is, you want to say, what is there about New York or San Francisco that makes it distinctive, such as size, or in terms of, or having a Wall Street, or having the there are a lot of terrific books on these 2 cities, and how in the last, say, after World War II, and what's nationally and internationally visible. That is, in the 19th century, this was the gold attraction for the West. I mean, people left Europe and said, oh yeah, let's go to America somewhere, and because they've got gold. And then where would they go specifically? San Francisco. Okay, that's late 20th century. That doesn't matter anymore. It was gays were defining a distinctive openness to sexual identity in ways that were in direct confrontation with the rest of the world, and especially the rest of the U.S. So having these and then I talked about it, I guess, on Monday, how it had as a government paid for budgetary commitment to change your gender if you wanted to do so while you are working for the city of San Francisco, in ways that no other city did that at all. This was 10 years, 20 years before this sort of thing was being discussed. This is probably 20 or 30 years ago. So in that sense, San Francisco has done things. I mean, in that example, that's very extreme, but it illustrates the kinds of things which then Richard Florida had written about when he talks about creativity. He doesn't just talk about gender change. He talks about the next generalization could be innovation, or in turn could be creativity, or then bohemian. But in that sense, these are more general concepts which can be used as we talked about it in Paris. But it wasn't the specific neighborhood in Paris that meant that we're trying to say is critically important. It's being able to have a separate kind of identity linked with a neighborhood and a lifestyle, which in turn Balzac and Baudelaire then argued is essential or valuable to create a better art, because you don't feel the constraints that you can't think or write or do these kinds of more traditional things. Okay, so in that sense, Theaster wants to do this. That is, he's an artist as well as a developer, as well as a cook, as well as a black young man, as well as a former employee of the city of Chicago, where his job was to try to make the subway stops the L stops they're called here, called L, the trains, whatever, a little less terrible, and as they are considered, bad, to be very crude. I'm mentioning these different statuses which he has occupied, but is because he's still doing it, and he can and does humorously and ironically combine these things. And so he'll talk about, I've got to go. Noah is right there on Lake Michigan. I don't know if I can get through the streets because of the gunfire, if I'll be able to get there in time. And so his combination of the Bible with danger, with streets, etc. He has these kinds of things which most people don't talk about. So, did you have anything else in your draft there in the back of your mind about anything else you might, that is in a couple of weeks which you've got to do to write the paper, what else might you concretely do that might be helpful?
I'd say outside of what we discussed, kind of more of the conclusion takeaways towards the end of the paper, once I've discussed kind of the things that we laid out over the past 20 minutes, would be more of like the kind of blueprint strategies that could be applied in order to.
You got it on here? Okay, good.
In order to kind of actualize Theaster's kind of vision and his work as kind of a blueprint for others. I guess that would kind of be the one kind of more concluding piece of the paper that I've been thinking about that we haven't talked about yet.
Yeah, I mentioned briefly, people, when he made a presentation, when he was appointed at the Harris School for a cultural policy position, and the dean of the Harris School the Secretary of Cultural Affairs from the city of Chicago and the head of the foundation that had given him several $100,000 to do these kinds of things, all three asked the same question, which is your question. How can you scale this up? You know, we want to think bigger. And so in the meantime, and he said, well, I don't know, basically. He almost says that in those terms. But my point is, in between, since then, he has learned a lot. He's thought about this. The most visible written example was what he presented on that one day, and which is summarized in what we have in the syllabus, which is what did they write about ethical relativism. And so, in that sense, he's been speaking about these things. He does lots of videos. He talks at all kinds of conferences, and he's been given lots of money in Japan. I don't know what he's specifically doing in Japan, but I think it's going to be fairly different from where he's normally worked in African American neighborhoods in Detroit and Chicago and maybe one other American city for the most part. So how he's changed it, I mean, I haven't looked into it just in detail myself, but you might glance at that and see if there are any discussions where he's talked about, you know, where and why did he go? Has he gone to Japan? Was it money? Was it land? Was it staff? Something of that sort. Some of the resources which he didn't have access to here, but he had a lot of access. He had a lot of resource potential, and he was awarded the prize of the most important artist, and I think the term was important artist globally in an Italian major conference. And so after that, I mean, he's a star, and so where and how he can use those in ways that he in turn is raising his own ambitions and insights. He knows he's not unique. He knows there are a lot of other people who are artists who want to do exactly what you said in the first 2 or 3 minutes of your paper. But how to do that and how to put some things down in ways that others can build on is great. It's great to do however you can. But I'd say look at some of the examples of the best, and that's what he himself has learned in the last 5 years or so. Okay. Anything else that we might have from the others here who want to comment on what we've heard? Questions? Okay. Let me talk a little bit about a couple of big themes here. There are lots of sections. Lots of readings in a couple of sections here, which we're covering in the roughly weeks 6 and 7. And I mentioned, I talked earlier about the Walter Benjamin Paris, capital of the 19th century, and the importance of it in refusing industry. I mean, refusing and even though he himself would have said, "I am a Marxist," I mean, he refused to follow the Marxist laws of history that you must go from industry, from agriculture to industry to post-industrial to socialism to communism. That is, he talks and writes in these terms. At the same time, he brings in consumption, the flaneur, taste, aesthetics, choosing a necktie, and the like. And in that way, this has then not only among Marxists, and it's dramatic to see it even by a Marxist, by him seeing how he writes these together, 2 lines apart within the same paragraph. He has bits of Marx, and then he has bits of aesthetics, which come from his literary aesthetic background, and then turns to, say, Baudelaire, to the poetry, and to the observations around Paris to implement this. Okay. Vildovsky I talked about in terms of the drastic changes before and after Proposition 13 in California. So the taxpayers' revolt led him to say, wow, my whole theory of budgeting was wrong. And if I look back historically, it's not always simple incremental change. I mean, we've got some revolutions, we've got some big changes. Let's look at some of these. So he did that, and then the section here is called a cultural theory of leadership, that places leadership in a cultural context after the taxpayers' revolt. An extension of this is the paper, it's part of a book from Paul Schumaker called Critical Pluralism, Democratic Performance and Community Power. It's written about the town where the publisher is located, called Lawrence, Kansas. Small town, university town. But the interesting point was criticizing implicitly that the followers of many community power studies said business leadership wants to dominate Atlanta, or there may be some business, other types of policies where in Atlanta the business leadership may not be crudely and simply articulated, quote, business interests, but they interpenetrate and work with the political leadership. In the stone readings which we had. The problem with all of those statements is what Schumaker points to and says, wait, these discussions of business leadership imply that businesses are in conflict with other people like citizens and voters. So he said, let's do a survey of the citizens of Lawrence, Kansas. Do you want what the business leadership wants? And he then had a list of maybe 20 questions. Would you like to have more growth? Would you like to have new development? Would you like to have more density by increasing streets for certain areas and not others? Would you want to change zoning? So with a series of items like this, his simple bottom line was what? Citizens did not have anything very different, substantially different from the business leadership. The business leadership, many of them may have been local, and this same point has then been shown in a couple of other papers say, for instance, on Lake Tahoe. Lake Tahoe has this dramatic, beautiful lake, California, for skiing, for mountain climbing, etc. And there are many businesses that are hotels, restaurants, and the like. And the business leadership wants exactly, it's funny, but you close, once you leave them halfway open but halfway closed, just a little.
This one?
Yeah, two or three of them. Yeah, that's fine. Both of them here, it's fine. That's good. So my point is, some business leaders want to have things be beautiful, and this is what Theaster is trying to do himself. So I'm saying business. He's wearing a hat, and he even drew one thing on his presentation. Cool developer, to define himself. And then he had a different colored marker. So here's how the business development would normally do in Chicago. They have this. So we have the cool, then he picked up a red marker and said, now with a red marker, cool developer does this, instead does this, instead we do that, instead we do that. Okay, so in that sense, maybe the cool developer is in that sense different in Chicago and the neighborhoods that he's looking at, but in Lake Tahoe or in Lawrence, Kansas, there may be no conflict. So the point of that is to, and I'm pointing to something that was omitted for the huge majority of the literature on community power in the 50s, 60s, and 70s. Nobody talked about values. All they talked about was power and money, and were they business or political leaders, but they didn't have an explicit, such as saying we want to make things be more equal. We want to make people more equal, or we want to say we want to have more democratic participation to build legitimacy. I mean, that became a big. This goes right back to Tocqueville, but this is what Putnam paid a lot of attention to, because this is an outgrowth, I would say, in turn, from the counterculture of the 1968 revolution, in a sense, on campuses and around the world. In those years, that heightened the general sensitivity to and imposing equality much further and taking it in a different way from the past. Okay, so in those senses, there are themes which came from the study of what started as leadership, but ended up adding a more multi-causal, multi-dimensional aspect for analyzing cities, and the reason for studying cities in this course, in the case of me, is that we're not interested just in cities per se, but because I understand life and the world more generally, international relations, etc. Okay, how to move in that direction. Another example, Barbara Furman, Challenging the Growth Machine, general abstract title. But the interesting thing about her is doesn't sound very complicated, it sounds very simple. She just compared Chicago and Pittsburgh. But what she did was not to describe the two. She used those descriptive materials to show that, for instance, if we want to have a park in Pittsburgh, and people who want to have a park, they may get together, they have a meeting, say, let's write a petition, they'll take it to the city council, they go to a hearing, have a council member who wants to back it, and they'll talk about it, and it may get discussed by the Buildings and Grounds Committee, and then the budget may be approved or may be turned down. Okay, that's Pittsburgh. It sounds very ordinary and simplistic. So her point is, when you try to do the same thing in Chicago, you want to talk about a new park, and what happens? Not that at all. It gets redefined as in terms of race, in terms of power, in terms of is this part of the machine or not? And that relabeling in terms of those categories were the key drivers and, if you will, the pieces which held and which focused the classic aspects of Chicago politics drastically different from Pittsburgh. And she then points out briefly, Pittsburgh was basically much closer to Chicago 20 years before it. If they'd had a machine, Pittsburgh had a major classic political machine, and it was beaten by, as we described in the chapter of City Money. Peter Flaherty destroyed it, and he brought a so-called reforms approach, in which case issues could have their issue specificity of parks being handled in terms of a parks committee and parks issues, aesthetics or exercise or whatever the different people would think about why parks were good. Whereas, and as I'm reminding myself as I drive around in Chicago now, there are many little signs that I pass by regularly which say, "Park kids." Parks are good. Parks are good jobs. There are lots of things that are playing up the specifics of the parks in Chicago now, which didn't at all when she wrote this. So in that sense, these are specifics of the political culture, and so she then, I'm pointing to these dimensions, but she in turn then links these to theories from Clarence Stone and from others that had written about machines, and who had contrasted that with land use, that is 3, 4, 5 literatures, which he basically is saying change the core ideas of how business domination or the machine, the political machine, had its driving dynamic transformed in ways that I can point out, as we've read now a little bit about scenescapes. If the scene changes, if we're in a different framework, a different context, and I'm pointing to Tahoe, Pittsburgh after Peter Flaherty, these things change the rules of the game. So it's not as if you didn't have parks before. It simply changed the way that parks got treated, budgeted, and so forth. Another big fat book in literal terms. It's called The Power Broker by Robert Caro, C-A-R-O. He's a New York journalist, suburban, and he wrote 2 or 3 fat books like this, one on Lyndon Johnson as well. But the Power Broker, Robert Moses and the Fall of New York. I've talked about this before, where Robert Moses wanted to build freeways that have freeways that go from Manhattan right out onto Long Island, and he did. And so they were fought to some degree, but not very much to stop it. Whereas when they got to Manhattan, Jane Jacob really organized, and that was the fall of Robert Moses, in the sense that everyone said Robert Moses could. Whatever he wanted, he got, and it happened. And Jane Jacobs showed you can change the rules of the game. And Jane Jacobs' books then on the driving aspects of innovations are for the economy of cities, transform the whole economy. So Ed Glazer, the top urban economist in the world, I can say. Also, Gary Becker from Student Here, we showed him at the beginning at Harvard. One of his 3 papers tried to look at different aspects of innovation. He said, here's slightly different ways of analyzing the innovation. And the one which worked best with her data, his data to test her alternative, was that her alternative interpretation was the most strongly supported by the quantitative data analysis. Okay, another name to remember is James Norquist, N-O-R-Q-U-I-S-T, The Wealth of Cities. He was mayor of Milwaukee. He had a downtown that had the aspects that you describe as historically, abandoned, whatever. Rundown, high crime, racial conflict, etc. Moving away from the downtown areas of the upper middle class, and distinctively white residents of Milwaukee. What did he do? He closed the freeway access, so you couldn't exit and get in and out of the freeway in the middle of downtown at all. He hated cars. He didn't want the cars to be connecting people in and out of Milwaukee. And many people then said, you'll completely destroy the economy. This is not a small town, ideal, carless place. This is going to be the trucks that deliver everything. and the opposite happened. It led the economy and the downtown area to dramatically improve. And he was so successful in this way that he then, after 2 or 3 terms as mayor, he became the executive director of a Chicago, based in Chicago, but it was an international foundation on how you can build the sensitivity to planning to build zoning and construction in ways that are consistent with aesthetics. He came to my class here. He made a presentation with a whole bunch of slides, and they were mostly about medieval cities in Italy. The time of Leonardo da Vinci, when they were building those cities. And so what he would then say, look at the aesthetics of that view, which they have there. At the end of that city, there's another cross street there, and there's a church. And the church is higher. It goes up 3 stories and 4 stories, where the other buildings are only at 2 stories. So the church dominates the rest of the city. So these kinds of aesthetic principles he talked about. And so he's the mayor. He's talking about economic development of Milwaukee, and he's got this stuff from medieval Italy. Okay, he did that, and then I saw him do this with audiences that were people from Japan, from China, and so forth. And he traveled to them, and so. The issues have become more visible and more salient with the discussions of sustainability, of health, the depletion of oil, gasoline, etc. As these have grown more recognized. But the point was, he started doing this in his own city. Let me add one more big point where he was revolutionary. His own city, Milwaukee, when I worked with him earlier with the U.S. Conference of Mayors, several of those mayors were the major pressures to have the federal government transfer more money to the cities. And it worked. This happened in the war on poverty years from Lyndon Johnson, Jack Kennedy. Lots of new amounts of money was transferred, and what they wanted and what they got from Milwaukee in the lead was we'll call it general revenue sharing, GRS, which means you can choose locally what to spend on. That is, many of the people in U.S. Congress wanted to say, we want to give this for people who have wheelchairs. We want to have sidewalks require that there's a little edge, that there's not a curb that is not possible to get up there if you're in a wheelchair. So we now have thousands and millions of streets that have been imposed by the U.S. Congress, and so you have to millions and billions of dollars to change. Okay, that's what the Congress generally wanted. What the Conference of Mayors said, we don't want that. We want the mayors, and we want the local officials, local decision makers, the citizens. They ought to choose which they should do. And so the general revenue sharing could have been roughly, in some cases, 20% of their budget, or 20% of what they got from the federal government. That is lots of money. Norquist said, and he wrote this roughly at the time of Reagan as president, and he said, Reagan wants to cut the money. Let's not. So I told you the speeches by on Monday when Coleman Young was the mayor of Detroit, and then soon thereafter Harold Washington, African American mayors were fighting and angrily attacking the national government because they were taking money away from the cities. Norquist says the opposite. Don't take the money. Use your local funds and cut back. and do things better by responding to your local priorities and do what people want. And many things are cheap or free. Closing the freeways don't cost anything. What it does is to put up a big sign which says, we don't want simply trucks coming in and out of our city, and we don't want a lot of people in cars. And so they had an expansion of public transit, bicycles, other ways of people getting in and out, or living downtown. And so, so he then sparked the aesthetics, and that was the other part of his program. Was developed by there were some grad students at Yale. Actually, there were grad students working on planning and aesthetics and so forth. And he picked it up and then used it there, and then used it nationally and internationally. Okay, so there's a picture which a video I sometimes show, which I'll skip for reasons of time. They show him interviewing the mayor of Seoul, Korea, and he's there with his feet, with his shoes off, with his bare feet in the river, going right by the downtown, right in the middle of downtown Seoul, like the Chicago River in the middle of Chicago, celebrating the fact that he closed down the freeway, which was there in the middle of Seoul, which was constructed right after World War II. So it didn't exist before. They put in a freeway, and he then, 40, 50 years later, closed down the entire freeway. And Seoul, how big is Seoul? Seoul is something more than 4 times bigger than New York. It's New York, Chicago, Paris, and one more. Seoul, these big cities, Beijing, not Beijing, Shanghai, Seoul, these make Western cities look tiny. And then to have the the biggest visible freeway, he closed down. Would this not completely destroy? So many of the economics courses which you read about, of course, transportation, railroad. The reason Chicago is so successful and so dynamic and such a big city, and it grew to become the second largest city in the U.S. because of railroads. Okay, you read that in book after book after book. If you close down the railroads, you close down the freeways now. You should, if this causal statement is true, you destroy the economy. Well, maybe the theory is wrong. Okay, and so what he's showing is, and this is what we're showing, that we're not saying that railroads don't matter, but that they're in conflict with other alternatives. And if you've got people and so what has happened then with his initiative, and then other people with it, they built up a new perspective of how you can build a city, and it worked in Milwaukee. And so he's then simply illustrating that Seoul has done the same thing. And after they've torn down that area, Seoul has grown even more. It's half the whole population of the country of Korea is in the city of Seoul, and people are moving there faster than they were even before, but not because, and they've substantially increased mass transit. They've got a train system all over the place. They've got some buses, but trains and the large numbers really can travel all around within Seoul, rather than with cars. So it's done, and so the many of the rules of the game that we think of are universal. If we can, and that's why we're having these books on the reading list, because we're finding some things that break the rules, and we can learn from this by seeing outliers are interesting. If you do a regression line, we got a lot of things are near that regression line, but if you look for places that are really off that area. Why are they so different? I mean, how are they? So Paris in the 19th century, Norquist with Milwaukee. Another one just briefly on this is Donald Rosdell, The Context of Radical Populism in U.S. Cities. His book version is called The Cultural Contradictions of Progressive Politics. He only has about 4 or 5 cities in the whole U.S. One of them is called Bennington. I think it's Bennington. No, I think it's the mayor for several terms was named Bernard Sanders. Bernard Sanders has been making headlines in the last week by saying the whole Democratic Party is out to lunch. We lost to Trump because we've done the wrong things. We've abandoned the American worker. And if you abandon the American worker, of course you're going to abandon the party. So this is Bernard. He's been saying this ever since he was a Marxist grad student at the University of Chicago, and from Brooklyn. Rosdell looks at the other places and other mayors that tried to drastically change. So he first asked where and how did one city like Bennington or I think Santa Monica in the LA area and a couple of others. He studies where and how these places are so different and how do they survive at all. And where did they get that way, and what kinds of rules of the game do they follow? What scene does this illustrate in ways that we can learn about more the regression line? The Harold Baldersheim et al. Is a book that came from really our project called Fiscal Austerity and Urban Innovation I've mentioned to you. And we've mostly started with many US examples, but soon after we were starting the project here in the US, Harold Baldersheim was we were at a meeting in Mexico City, and with a couple of other Scandinavians initially, they said, why don't we do the same thing in the U.S.? Let's get us together. We don't need to have one big pot of money. Instead, we will get little pots of money, and by combining them and sharing the data and using a consistent way of collecting the data and then analyzing it in different ways. If we have different theories, different hypotheses, we'll test them. But in that way, we can cover the world. So they started doing it with just a few countries, but the point is, then the one guy who's a co-editor here, co-author, where I did a couple of chapters with him, was Paweł Świenkiewicz from Poland. I think this was 2 years before 1989. 1989 was the collapse of the Berlin Wall. Okay, in Eastern Europe, this was massive. So when the Berlin Wall went down, the East Europeans, government officials, political scientists, sociologists, economists said, hey, let's connect with the people doing this in the rest of the world. Now we don't have to follow the Moscow-led way of approaching and thinking, and so the Communist Party headquarters in Warsaw became the Warsaw stock market. So they did things like that, transforming the rules of the game. The secret police just so hated people, and they've arrested and murdered people and so forth. Then I've forgotten what they did with that building, but they transformed these things around. So that is, we had planned a conference a year before, we had no idea that the Berlin Wall was going to go down, but it happened. And so these East Europeans then said, "Hey, we really want to participate in this." And so we then said, "Okay, there's a lot of interest, a lot of people who wanted to study cities. There were so the national and local leaders said, what's the role of government? How much should we privatize? Should we have private or public buses? Should we have private or public banks? Should we have schools, etc.? How much of this, and then different cities, different countries in Eastern Europe, all went through these kinds of discussions, and they followed drastically different rules of the game. So basically, what this does is to look at where, and so many people were saying in the U.S., Western Europe, capitalism causes this. Well, look more closely then. Look at how you have Eastern Europe. They changed things from communism to capitalism in some cases. And what happened in some of the first elections was they re-elected communists democratically in a, not often a majority, but that a plurality in many towns and many of the some of the national governments. I think it was the Hungary, but there was, that is, parts of Marxism was egalitarianism and trying to push in an egalitarian direction. Okay, can you do this? And so this is a hot issue within China now, because within China you have both capitalism within a socialist, that you have a capitalist context with banks and international trade and so forth in China, but you also have a very strong political system with a very strong communist party. So all of this is all present within China, and in terms of Eastern Europe, they changed from one, and so so then they said they were making each of these decisions. How much should we have of each? And China is going through this now. Well, okay. So in this sense, why am I saying this is important for students in thinking through and talking about? If you the students following C. Wright Mills, you are the new proletariat. Think about being more careful about, is capitalism causing, quote unquote, this or that? Look at places which are predominantly capitalist or communist, and where and how do things change or not change. So for instance, I spent a lot of time working with people also from Yugoslavia, because that was considered long before 1989. This was where a strong communist government and national leaders said, we want to have democracy and socialism. And so they started to try to do that, but then the question was, how much democracy and how much socialism do you have? So there were a number of studies to try, and I work with others as well, on these ways that we can try to measure these more systematically. Okay, we're near the end on this. Any comments, questions from you folks on any things that I've been saying today, or that we could link this with Theaster, or anything else you've thought about? You've been quiet today. You want to raise anything?
No, I thought his paper topic was interesting, just listening to it, thinking about like the lacking areas and how there's certain areas just on the south side of Chicago that are lagging compared to others. And I think there's like, just downtown Chicago, it's particularly interesting how there's like certain areas like Wicker Park and other places that just develop so quickly into popular, trendy places, and then these other neighborhoods get left behind, and then people just flock to those neighborhoods, so they continue to grow and blossom, and it's kind of this cycle where once a certain neighborhood starts getting attention, capital, and the means to grow, it continues to do so, and then other neighborhoods don't get that. So it just continues to widen this disparity between different neighborhoods in Chicago. So I kind of thought that was interesting, his point about redevelopment.
Yes, but I would agree with for sure, there's diversity, there's fragmentation. I would simply add the important point that you can have neighborhoods go up and then down and up and down within 20 or 30 years. They can get more popular, less popular, and especially if you look for things like media or nightclubs or restaurants, which are more or less. And we've had several excellent student papers, especially in this course, where students have explored these in more detail, taking one neighborhood and then how it went up and down and where and why as people moved in. And that places especially involved artists or more bohemian folks, and they changed. So Wicker Park was the model and written up in Rich Lloyd's book, Neo Bohemia, its title. But the point is, it's no longer. The citizens are predominantly of that same background as they were in the past. They're more often lawyers, stockbrokers, people not doing normal artistic jobs, but they tend not to be wanting to live in Lincoln Park or in the Loop or the so-called Gold Coast. They want to be surrounded by more, and so the term is bobo, bohemian and bourgeois mixed together. And so we get this, and where and how these then mix in different cities, different neighborhoods are subtle things that are pursuing right now. Okay, thank you folks. We will see you Monday.